I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The report landed on the archivist's desk like a thunderclap. One of Queen Elizabeth II's most personal jewels, the sapphire chrysanthemum brooch she wore in her wedding portraits, was missing from the official inventory. In that instant, whispers turned to alarms, and even the walls of Sandringham seemed to hold their breath. Imagine opening a royal ledger and finding a gap where history itself should be. That's exactly what a small team discovered, and it sent shockwaves through the corridors of the crown. Dear viewer, this wasn't merely a case of a misplaced jewel. It was the slow unraveling of the monarchy's identity, thread by thread. The sapphire brooch wasn't just an ornament. It was a symbol of Elizabeth's enduring bond with her people, a token of duty and devotion worn during moments of triumph, grief, and diplomacy. To realize it had quietly vanished was like finding a missing page torn from Britain's story. When I first saw the archivist's notes, lines hastily crossed out, red markings abruptly erased, it felt less like a clerical oversight and more like an attempt to bury a truth, and that truth, if uncovered, could ignite a confrontation unlike anything the monarchy had faced since the abdication crisis nearly a century ago. The scene in the archive room was unforgettable. The hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of old paper and dust, and the archivist's hand trembling as they underlined the absence again and again. Outside, the world carried on, unaware that a jewel tied to 7 decades of reign had quietly slipped into shadow. This was no accident, and as the clues began to point toward Queen Camilla, a quiet storm began brewing inside the House of Windsor. Stay until the end, because what began with a single missing brooch may yet redefine the legacy of the British monarchy itself. To understand the gravity of this discovery, we need to step back into the history of royal heirlooms. Within the British monarchy, jewelry has never been mere decoration. It has been currency, diplomacy, armor, and even prophecy. Queen Elizabeth II herself once remarked that every jewel carried a memory, a moment of service to the nation. When she wore the sapphire chrysanthemum brooch during her 1947 honeymoon, it was not simply a newlywed's adornment. It was an emblem of post-war hope, a quiet message to a weary nation that continuity would endure hardship. Royal heirlooms occupy a peculiar space between public and private. The crown jewels, those used for coronations and state ceremonies, are protected by law and kept in the Tower of London. But personal jewels, passed down through family lines, live in a shadowy realm, not entirely private, yet not wholly public. They carry sentiment, yes, but also immense diplomatic power. And it is precisely within this gray area that confusion and scandal can take root. There is precedent. Queen Mary, Elizabeth's formidable grandmother, was famous for reclaiming jewels she believed rightfully belonged to the crown. Once, she demanded a tiara back from a cousin, declaring bluntly that it was never truly theirs to keep. That same streak of possessiveness lived in Elizabeth, tempered by grace, but unmistakable. She catalogued her collection with meticulous care, often leaving personal notes for archivists about which items should remain part of the royal collection and which might be lent for use. Yet even her precision had limits. Those notes were not law, only guidance, vulnerable to interpretation, and perhaps manipulation. And it was in that space between legacy and ambiguity that the next great royal scandal found its spark. Camilla, now queen consort, entered this world of blurred ownership at the most delicate of times. In the months following Elizabeth's death in September 2022, the palace was engulfed in transition. Staff shifted roles, ledgers were rewritten, and centuries of tradition had to be reorganized within weeks. Public attention focused on Charles's accession, the first king in 70 years. But behind the pomp, archivists quietly undertook one of the most sensitive tasks in the monarchy, reconciling Elizabeth's private collection. It was during that reconciliation that anomalies began to surface. Not just the chrysanthemum brooch, but a sapphire pendant gifted during the 1952 Commonwealth tour and an emerald necklace once thought destined for Princess Charlotte. Each absence chipped away at confidence, And in a monarchy where symbolism often outweighs substance, missing heirlooms meant missing fragments of the nation's story. The irony was not lost on observers. For decades, Camilla had been seen as the interloper, overshadowing Diana's tragic light. She had spent years rehabilitating her image, positioning herself as a steady, grandmotherly consort beside Charles. Yet now, whispers circulated that she had quietly amassed treasures never meant to be hers. In the court of public perception, tolerance can shift swiftly to suspicion, and the suspicion deepened when palace aides recalled peculiar details. At private receptions in late 2022, Camilla was noted wearing brooches and pendants that did not appear in the official ledgers. When asked, she reportedly laughed them off as misfiled. To an ordinary observer, it seemed a flippant dismissal. To Anne, Elizabeth's only daughter, it was an alarming signal. Anne, known for her no-nonsense discipline and fierce loyalty to her mother, understood the distinction between clerical error and concealment. Her memories sharpened the sting. The Victorian brooch meant for Anne herself, the sapphire necklace intended to pass to Charlotte, the emerald choker symbolizing restraint and heritage. These were not mere trinkets. They were promises written in gold and stone. To see them vanish under a haze of excuses felt like betrayal. Outside palace gates, the public remained unaware, but within, corridors buzzed with unease. The Royal Collection Trust, responsible for cataloging tens of thousands of items, kept silent. The monarchy has always operated best behind closed doors, but in this case, the silence grew heavy, carrying the weight of heritage slipping away. This was the stage upon which Anne and Camilla would soon clash. One, the custodian of her mother's legacy, determined to honor Elizabeth's wishes. The other, the consort, believing her new crown entitled her to redefine traditions. Between them lay jewels older than empires, heirlooms that had outlasted wars and abdications, now at the mercy of whispers, suspicions, and a vault said to exist beyond the official record. The foundation was cracking, and everyone in those gilded halls knew it. It began with whispers in palace corridors, soft yet persistent. Archivists handling Queen Elizabeth II's private ledgers began noticing inconsistencies. One page in the inventory of jewels bore faint eraser marks. A red ink notation had been scratched out and rewritten in blue, as if someone had tried to disguise the change. When pressed, staff explained the inconsistencies as mere clerical adjustments during the transitional period. But to seasoned eyes, the anomalies looked deliberate. The most glaring was the disappearance of a sapphire pendant presented to Elizabeth during her 1952 Commonwealth tour of South Africa. This was no minor trinket. It had been worn repeatedly in portraits symbolizing her bond with nations abroad. To suddenly vanish from the official record raised immediate alarm. An archivist confided that when older photographs were compared to the ledgers, the descriptions no longer matched. It was as if the jewel had evaporated from official memory. The unease intensified in December 2022 during a private reception at Clarence House, when Camilla appeared wearing a brooch no one had seen in public for decades. Courtiers recognized it instantly as the Victorian sapphire brooch, closely linked to Elizabeth's early reign. When asked about its origin, Camilla reportedly smiled and said, "Oh, just something misplaced in storage." Her tone was light. But for those familiar with the strict rules of royal cataloging, the remark echoed like thunder. The first signs of a larger mystery became visible, not only in missing items, but in patterns of behavior. Staff noticed that pieces expected for display at state occasions quietly failed to appear. Even more curious were certain gifts from foreign dignitaries, traditionally catalogued and stored, that were absent from the new ledgers. A pearl tiara presented during a 1972 Canadian state visit, and a necklace tied to Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee in 1977. If these items had truly been misfiled, it suggested the palace's entire record-keeping system was at risk. Public opinion still leaned toward forgiveness at that stage, especially after Charles's coronation in May 2023 shifted global attention. Yet beneath the surface, polling revealed cracks. A YouGov survey from spring 2023 showed that only 32% of Britons viewed Camilla favorably, while 44% admitted lingering negative feelings. For a monarchy dependent on perception, those numbers mattered, and whispers of missing heirlooms threatened to drag her reputation back into the shadows. When I first saw reports of these anomalies, my mind immediately went to Princess Anne, Elizabeth's most steadfast child, the one who shouldered duty without complaint. If anyone would notice the shift, it would be her. Indeed, aides later revealed that Anne kept a personal notebook cataloging pieces her mother had promised to specific heirs. To her, the loss of even a single jewel was not just theft. It was a broken promise. The imagery from this period is haunting. Archivists under dim fluorescent lights, flipping through worn ledgers with trembling fingers. Anne in her private study at Gatcombe Park, rereading her mother's handwritten notes detailing which pieces were destined for which generation, and Camilla stepping out for public events draped in items that seemed to appear from nowhere, each a glittering question mark under the camera flashes. This is where I turn to you. Imagine being in Princess Anne's position, watching symbols of your mother's legacy vanish one by one. Would you confront your sister-in-law publicly, or work quietly behind the scenes to recover what was lost? And as you watch this, let me know in the comments which city or country you are tuning in from. It fascinates me how stories about the British monarchy resonate around the globe. From London to Sydney to New York, the tension was rising. It was no longer possible to dismiss these anomalies as mistakes. Too many items, too many excuses, and too much at stake. The vault at Camilla's Gloucestershire estate became a focal point of speculation, with insiders whispering that objects once photographed on Elizabeth were now hidden there. Some staff swore they recognized her initials faintly etched on a storage trunk. Others dismissed it as paranoia. But suspicion is a fire that spreads quickly, and by early 2023, it was roaring through the palace. The stage was set, and the signs were undeniable. What had begun as clerical oddities was now turning into a full-blown confrontation, and Princess Anne was poised to move from suspicion into action, ready to expose what lay behind closed doors. Behind the glittering facade of the monarchy, real drama rarely plays out in public. It unfolds in whispers, closed-door meetings, and fragments of evidence passed from one cautious hand to another. The story of Camilla's alleged vault was no exception. By early 2023, rumors had hardened into suspicions, drawing clear lines between allies and adversaries within the House of Windsor. The first serious tip came from a former aide who had worked closely with Camilla. In an off-the-record interview, the aide described a private storage room at Camilla's Gloucestershire estate. Unlike Ray Mill House, often associated with her in the press, this location had never been reported in detail, making the claim all the more unsettling. The aide insisted that several items connected to Queen Elizabeth II had been quietly moved there in the weeks following her passing. "It wasn't a warehouse," the aide whispered. "It was a vault with locks old and new, accessible to only a handful of people." Anne, known for her meticulousness and direct approach, took the revelation seriously. She understood the power of information and began keeping her own log of conversations, reports, and private notations, without alerting Charles. In her study at Gatcombe Park, she filled a leather-bound notebook with every detail: dates, missing pieces, testimonies, and her mother's handwritten instructions for the jewels. One entry copied from Elizabeth's notes read, "The emerald choker to symbolize restraint reserved for Charlotte in future." To Anne, this was not sentimentality. It was duty. Other information came from palace staff noticing oddities. One archivist mentioned that digital logs from the Royal Collection Trust, which typically updated inventories in real time, suddenly carried gaps for certain high-profile pieces. Files previously accessible under Elizabeth II's private collection had been restricted or deleted. Another staffer reported seeing couriers delivering crates to Gloucestershire under the pretext of personal items, but the boxes bore old Royal Collection stickers. Individually, none of this was conclusive, but together the pattern was damning. Public appearances added further fuel to the fire. In March 2023, Camilla attended a small charity gala in Bath wearing a necklace remarkably similar to the sapphire pendant given to Elizabeth during her South African tour. Photographs circulated on social media, sparking debate. Some insisted it was a different piece, but jewelry historians noted that the cut of the stone and the arrangement of the diamonds matched archival photos exactly. The story faded quickly from mainstream news, but within royal circles, suspicion burned hotter than ever. Anne's resolve strengthened with each passing week. To her, this was not merely about jewels. It was about her mother's legacy being appropriated for convenience. Elizabeth II had been deliberate in how her heirlooms should be handled, believing each piece carried symbolic weight for the monarchy's continuity. Seeing them disappear into private hands felt like betrayal. Anne confided in 2 trusted members of the Royal Protection Command, asking them to discreetly verify whether Camilla's estate housed a vault. Their findings confirmed her fears. The estate had a restricted wing with updated locks, and the logs of contractors who installed the security systems were missing. Pause for a moment and imagine knowing that items worn by your late mother, symbols of state and history, might be hidden away by the woman who replaced her in the nation's imagination. For Anne, the choice was clear: gather evidence, confront directly, and demand restitution. The details of her investigation read like a thriller. Discreet photographs of crates bearing royal markings, copies of ledgers with numbers that no longer aligned, and testimonies from 2 junior aides who swore they had seen a pearl tiara moved during late-night transfers. The aides described a tense, hushed atmosphere, with Camilla's personal staff insisting, "No notes, no signatures." The secrecy alone spoke volumes. Meanwhile, tension inside the family escalated. Charles, preoccupied with the demands of his early reign, seemed reluctant to acknowledge the issue. Advisors urged silence, fearing any admission could trigger a media firestorm. But silence only emboldened Anne. She began preparing a dossier, complete with photos, testimonies, and cross-referenced records, leaving little room for doubt. This was not gossip. It was a pattern. By now, the vault had become more than a storage space. It was a symbol of power. Camilla, once the target of public disdain, now stood at the center of a narrative portraying her as custodian of hidden treasures. Some saw her as a survivor who had earned her place beside Charles. Others viewed her as a shadow queen leveraging secrets to consolidate influence. Anne understood the stakes. She wasn't merely challenging a sister-in-law, she was defending the monarchy's integrity. The jewels represented history itself, gifts from Commonwealth nations, tokens of alliances, relics of continuity. If lost, hoarded, or misused, the damage would stain not only Camilla's name, but also the trust the monarchy had built over centuries. The final straw came when a consultant showed Anne high-resolution images depicting the emerald choker once belonging to Queen Mary, lying inside a trunk with markings suggesting it had been recently repacked. Alongside it were notes that did not match official royal collection numbering. For Anne, this was incontrovertible proof. She prepared for confrontation. No leaks to the press, no dramatic gestures, just a private audience, evidence in hand, and a resolve hardened by loyalty to her mother's memory. The vault was no longer rumor. It was real, and it was about to become the center of a storm capable of splitting the monarchy in 2. The day of the confrontation arrived with a silence heavier than ceremony. At Clarence's house, a private room was set aside, with no aides except 2 trusted witnesses, no journalists and no cameras. Princess Anne entered first, her step brisk, her face set with the steel resolve that had carried her through decades of royal duty. She placed a leather-bound dossier on the table, worn but meticulously organized. Inside were photographs, testimonies, and inventory logs that pointed to one inescapable truth. Jewels belonging to Queen Elizabeth II were missing, and all evidence traced back to Camilla. Minutes later, Camilla entered, accompanied by a single advisor. Pearls adorned her neck, understated yet deliberate, her chin held high as if bracing for an ambush. What followed was far from polite. Anne spoke first, her voice sharp and unwavering. "These heirlooms were not yours to move. They belong to my mother, and through her, To the people of this country. Camilla reacted swiftly, dismissing the accusations as absurd, attributing any discrepancies to clerical errors and misfiling during the chaotic months after Elizabeth's passing. Anne pressed on, sliding photographs across the table. Images of the emerald choker, the sapphire pendant, the Victorian brooch, each documented by sources outside Camilla's control. "Explain why these are in your private estate," Anne demanded, her finger tapping the page in a rhythm that echoed like a gavel. The tension was suffocating. Charles was deliberately kept away from the confrontation, yet his shadow loomed over the room. Advisors later noted that Anne's tone was not personal. It was cold, factual, and unyielding. She was not attacking a rival. She was defending a mother's legacy. Camilla faltered briefly. Her advisor shuffled papers, attempting to deflect by claiming the jewels were merely being temporarily safeguarded. But Anne anticipated the excuse. She presented testimonies from 2 junior aides who had witnessed the late-night transfers, executed under strict instructions of silence. Their accounts aligned perfectly with the inventory gaps, each statement bearing their signatures. For the first time, Camilla's composure wavered. Witnesses recalled her eyes flashing with panic before she regained control. Outside Clarence's house, rumors of the confrontation leaked within hours. The press reported only whispers. Anne had delivered an ultimatum. The timing could not have been worse. Charles was preparing for a major diplomatic reception. And suddenly, headlines exploded. Princess Anne challenges Queen Consort over missing jewels. Family divided by treasures of the past. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting Diana's name and holding signs declaring, "Her legacy, not yours." Social media amplified the storm. Hashtags like Royal Vault and Our Shadow Queen trended worldwide. A viral TikTok compared Camilla's recent appearances with archival photographs of Elizabeth from the 1950s, highlighting jewels that appeared strikingly similar. YouTube channels dissected the confrontation minute by minute, speculating about hidden vaults and replaying Diana's old interviews for context. For younger generations, the scandal transcended heirlooms. It was a story about transparency, trust, and a monarchy accused of concealing the truth. Google Trends recorded a surge of over 500% in searches for Camilla jewels within 24 hours. American talk shows turned the drama into nightly fodder, while Australian commentators debated whether the Commonwealth should continue honoring a monarchy embroiled in scandal. The controversy had clearly gone global. Charles, caught in the crossfire, convened an emergency meeting with advisors. Described as ashen and torn between loyalty to his wife and respect for his sister, he faced no easy choice. Some urged him to issue a public statement to clarify the situation, but Camilla resisted fiercely, insisting that acknowledgement would only inflame suspicion. "Silence is strength," she argued. For Anne, however, silence was betrayal. The defining image of the crisis came not from inside Clarence's house, but outside its gates. Mourners held aloft a giant photograph of Elizabeth II, adorned in her sapphire suite, candles flickering beneath, while another sign bore Diana's smiling face with the words, "Still our Queen." That juxtaposition captured the essence of the blow-up. Camilla, despite years of careful rehabilitation, was once again cast in the shadow of the women who came before her. The jewels had become more than ornaments. They were battle lines in a war over legacy. Though the confrontation humiliated Camilla, she refused to yield, insisting the heirlooms were safe and that the monarchy must present a united front. Anne's ultimatum, however, was unmistakable. Return the heirlooms to the royal collection or face public exposure. There was no middle ground. The monarchy had weathered abdications, divorces, and deaths. But this crisis, rooted in memory and heritage, threatened to fracture trust like few events since 1936. As night fell over Clarence's house, the silence of the jewels seemed louder than any word spoken.